When an earthquake happens, everything changes. For those affected, lives are upended, homes and businesses destroyed. But the hardest part sometimes occurs after the earthquake. The aftershocks, which can occur without notice, anytime, often jolt survivors out of a false sense of complacency that the worst is over. The aftershocks can be stronger, last longer, and cause more damage than the original earthquake. Here we are in 2021 dealing with the aftershocks of significant events that rocked our country in 2020. For a full year, we have felt the aftershocks. Thousands of COVID deaths despite an available vaccine, an attack on the U.S. Capitol, violent crimes against Asians, Muslims, and people of color, the continued struggle for racial equity and justice. We're still feeling the effects. It's clear now we will feel them for years to come. Understanding this, how do we adjust our thinking to this reality? How do we adjust our actions to help heal Charlotte-Mecklenburg and the rest of our community? We will explore these questions today. We invite you on a journey to learn, to think, to grow. So join us as we work to reconnect, rebuild, while reckoning with the past, and as we recommit to moving forward together.
Good morning. I'm Rick McDermott, Chair of CBI's Board of Directors. On behalf of Community Building Initiative, I welcome you to our 2021 Stakeholders Breakfast. For those of you who attended last year's Stakeholders Breakfast, you might recall that we introduced the concept of fault lines, fractures, rifts, and divisions, particularly related to issues of equity and inclusion that are part of who we are, buried in our personal ground and in the ground of our community. We've also experienced aftershocks, as Ray described in the opening video this morning. The aftershocks remind us not only that these fractures exist, but in the context of equity and inclusion, the aftershocks also remind us of our shared responsibility to do everything we can to repair the rifts and mend the divisions. Our program today is designed to equip all of us with knowledge, skills, and courage to soften or even prevent these aftershocks, to fight bias, to remove barriers to opportunity, and to build a more equitable and just Charlotte-Mecklenburg. That's CBI's mission. That's who we are. I'm proud to announce that nearly 1,000 people registered for this morning's program. If each of us wakes up to the discrimination and injustice occurring in our community, interrupts the inequitable systems and structures, and steps up to champion equal rights, access, and opportunity, imagine the change that we could bring to our community. I hope by the end of today's program, you will say, challenge accepted. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Wells Fargo, whose commitment to CBI has been unwavering. Wells Fargo has been our presenting sponsor of this Stakeholders Breakfast for the past 12 years, and their very own Kendall Phillips and Eugene Young have been serving on the planning committee for this year's event. Thank you to all of our sponsors. You can see the names and logos of these generous community-minded companies and organizations on your screen. The financial commitment of these organizations makes it possible for CBI to continue its work. I'm excited to announce that this is the largest number of sponsors ever for a CBI Stakeholders Breakfast event, which speaks not only to the importance of CBI's mission, but specifically to the focus of this year's breakfast and additional CBI programming that will continue into the new year, shining a light on the aftershocks occurring in our community. The sponsors are also listed on our website at cbicharlotte.org. If you feel moved to step up and support CBI's work as well, please click the donate button on your screen or visit our website at cbicharlotte.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us this morning. I know you will enjoy our program. I'd now like to introduce Diane English, CBI's Executive Director. And as I do, I'd like to announce, as many of you know, that Diane told us earlier this year that she would retire at the end of 2021. Those of you who know Diane or have been part of the CBI family over the years know that so much of what Diane and CBI has accomplished has been because of Diane's hard work and influence. We're going to talk more about that later this morning. But for now, I have the honor and privilege to introduce Diane English.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, always. Good morning to each of you. I bring greetings from CBI's incredible team as we once again connect across distance this December. As many of you know, I'm retiring, and as Rick just said, at the end of 2021, after 24 years that have changed and blessed my life. When it began in 1997, CBI was intended as a temporary task force to address a community crisis. Today, with the support of you and so many, it is a strong, mature, and trusted organization. Here's some of what I know. I know we have made and are making a difference in the lives of people and organizations, and that they are impacting our community. I know this work is long-term, evolving, and more relevant than ever. I also know that it is time for me not to leave the work, but rather to hand the baton off to leaders for CBI's next phase of impactful, engaging, and creative work. That's one thing I will surely miss about CBI, the container for growth and innovation and pilot programs it has always provided. I will miss beyond words my incredible staff team, our gifted and very independent program designers, as well as our volunteer leaders, our community partners, our generous donors, and our program participants, friends of and for a lifetime. Many of you have heard me refer to CBI as something akin to Hotel California, as in, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So beware. CBI's work challenges and energizes. It requires commitment, capacity, and courage. It is the work of each lifetime, yours and mine. So here's what's ahead for us this morning. 3 short videos that capture people on the streets of Charlotte-Mecklenburg talking about recommitting, reconnecting, and rebuilding. Insights from Dr. Clint Smith around reckoning with our past, the stories we've been told, the ones we repeat, and the ones we simply don't know, as he engages in a conversation with Charlotte's own Sonia Gant. Dedicated time for us to talk with one another. Ideas about how we as individuals and organizations can get connected with CBI. Plus, news of a CBI container for engagement coming in 2022. Don't miss a moment and participate by using the hashtag Aftershocks on social media. Your CBI placemat is an ideal way to share pictures of your notes and doodles, as well as thoughts the program is stirring up for you. So, buckle up and open up, and let's listen together to a few folks in our community sharing their thoughts about recommitting.
I guess for me, I'm part of the diversity and inclusion board at my company that I recently joined. And so that's been a way to help influence within my own specific sphere. It's definitely a little bit harder being new in a community, but at least knowing I have a position at my workplace that I can do things to make people feel more included in the workplace, definitely one step that I definitely try to do.
Yo sé que estamos en un país que no es verdad donde nosotros nacimos, pero nosotros construimos de alguna manera, apoyamos y trabajamos, pero desgraciadamente el racismo creo que no se ha terminado y es como muy difícil, está como muy arraigado, como muy difícil de quitarlo.
Prior to the pandemic, of course, I participated in a lot of volunteering activities, a lot of pro bono work, and things of that nature. But I would like to venture back into that and make a true commitment.
I have developed some very close friends who are people of color. And what I've said is I show up, I shut up, and I pay for lunch because we need to center people of color and back off.
I don't think that I'm doing enough. Even though my heart is in the right place, I don't really know where to go or what to do. And I think a lot of people are in that position. They really want to help, but they just don't know.
It is more of acknowledgement of saying, yes, we have a racial issue within this country, and not being afraid to talk about it.
So you get a sense of who I am and what I'm thinking about and how it pertains to just so many of the things that you all are thinking about today. So How the Word is Passed was born out of the origin story of it began in 2017 when I was watching the Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues to P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and thinking about, how these leaders of the Confederacy were part of the iconography of the entire city. And I was thinking about, well, what did it mean that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people? What did it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that changing a school name or taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee or making Juneteenth a holiday is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it is to say that help all of these things, all of these symbols, help us understand the ecosystem of stories and narratives that have been passed down over the course of generations that shape the very real material realities of what communities look like, and better inform us of how to make amends for the harm that has been done to different communities across and throughout American history. And so I was thinking about, well, how does my own city reckon with this history? And then more broadly, thinking about how the country reckons with this history. And so I'm going to share a brief excerpt from the book. Part of what I do is travel to different historical sites throughout the country: Monticello, Angola Prison, Whitney Plantation, New York City, Galveston, Texas, and try to explore, well, what stories are being told, which stories are not being told, and which places are doing something in between. And so I'll read a brief excerpt before we begin our conversation. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung across his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They call it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city that's filled with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederates and slave owners. Every day, Black children walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of Black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of Black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right on the man who mounted the heads of rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you?
Clint Smith, good morning to you officially, and welcome to the Community Building Initiatives Breakfast. Thank you so much for being with us and for reading. I can say that I thoroughly enjoyed the book, learned a great deal, and I want to bring you into today's theme. We're talking about reckoning with aftershocks. How do we recommit, reconnect, and rebuild our communities? And when I think about the events of the past 2 years that have really caused people to pause and reflect a little bit more, I think about not only the racial reckoning that happened after the murder of George Floyd, but also think about the Capitol riots, the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on our communities. And I think I want to just ask you, can we truly recommit, reconnect, and rebuild if we don't examine the past?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential to understand the context that created the social conditions of our communities. I think what happens is if you don't, and I write about this a little bit in the book, you have entire generations of young people who grow up thinking that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is somehow a reflection of the people in those communities and not a reflection of the things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And I saw this, I experienced it as a young Black person growing up in New Orleans. I experienced it as a teacher of young Black and Latino children in Prince George's County, Maryland, where if you don't give young people or any of us the tools and the history and the framework with which to understand how to make sense of the world, to understand how, as the great James Baldwin says in his 1964 essay, A Talk to Teachers, to help the child understand that they are not criminal, but it is in fact the society that created the conditions and the history that created the conditions of their community, that created the community saturated with poverty, that created the conditions in which violence would flourish, that created a lack of opportunity for upward mobility and jobs that pay fair wages and opportunity to move into different communities because of state-sanctioned housing segregation, all of those things. If our young people don't understand that history, then they begin to internalize so many of the disparities that we see manifest themselves in our society and in our cities, and begin to think that there is something wrong with them or there's something wrong with their community. And that's not only for Black and brown children, it's important for white children to be thinking about these things as well, so that all of us collectively can understand how our society has been shaped, so that we can make informed policy decisions about how to make amends for very specific sorts of harm that have been done to groups of people across generations.
I know that in addition to looking around your hometown, you also say the inspiration for this book were those high school students that you taught. And I appreciated reading in the chapter about your visit to Galveston, Texas, how inspired you were to see the young people leading the Juneteenth celebration. And you really make the point there. You reject the fact that if Black youth actually learn about the historical legacy of slavery, that they would be overwhelmed, that instead it's the opposite. As you said, it helps them better understand community.
Yeah, and I think about that all the time. I mean, I think in part because I didn't grow up with a lot of this information. And growing up in New Orleans, you know, I was inundated with these messages, as I was alluding to before, of all the things that were wrong with Black people, all the things that were wrong, that we were doing wrong, and all the things that we needed to do in order to like lift ourselves up so that we weren't experiencing so many of the disparities that exist. And I just didn't have the language and the history and the toolkit to push back against so much of the pathology that we were inundated with. And the nature of our public discourse at that point was very different than the nature of our public discourse now, which has been shifted. Right? There's been a profound shift in our public discourse around history, around sociology, around how we understand the history of this country over the past several years, largely because of the Black Lives Matter movement that has pushed us to more fully account for the conditions and the policies that created our carceral landscape, that created our community landscape, that created our school landscape. And when I saw these young people who, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, equipped with this information that I was just learning as an adult, I just kept thinking, like, how transformative would it have been for me to know this, right? And to not instead, because I didn't know, I felt a sense of emotional and psychological paralysis in some ways, where I knew what I was hearing was wrong. I knew what people were saying about my community was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong. And then when you don't know how to push back against something, sometimes you begin to internalize. And I think then you begin to internalize and start to believe at its most insidious and worst level some of the things that the world is telling you about yourself. And I think that learning the fullness of American history is something that can really, on both a sort of macro nation state level, but also on a hyper local community level, like learning the history of your community can really disabuse you of the idea that somehow the reason that different parts of the community look the way that they do are the result of singular decisions that people in those communities have made, and again, not the result of a larger set of national, state level, and local policy decisions over time.
Throughout the book, it was interesting to read the reactions of adults who are confronting the past and sometimes finding it was different than what they grew up with. I thought it was interesting, the two women who visited Monticello, and I think told you that some of the shine that they had always put on Thomas Jefferson was removed as they learned about his connections to slavery. And then I thought it was interesting, the owner of the Whitney plantation, where they have really put the story of enslaved people at the forefront. When you visit there, he talked about his discovered ignorance. But then going to the Memorial Day service that was hosted by the Sons of Confederate Veterans at Blandford Cemetery, you found people who didn't want to consider that what they had grown up believing was actually true. And I want to ask you, from all of those experiences and those conversations that you had with people, why do you think it is so difficult for us to confront discrepancies in the history we learned and really think about what it means to believe that maybe it was not true? What we've been told throughout our lives was not true.
I think that, and we were talking about this before, I wish we had an hour to talk about this and not 20 minutes, but because there's so much there. I think that part of what happens is, in this country, we have a difficult time holding multiple and often contradictory truths, in the sense that, for example, Thomas Jefferson is, embodies, I think, so many of the contradictions of America, in the sense that America is a place that's provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have simply never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here or one over here. It's that they are deeply entangled in one another. And I think Jefferson similarly sort of personifies that cognitive dissonance, where he is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his children. He wrote in one document, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and wrote in another text, Notes on the State of Virginia, that Black people are inherently inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Didn't believe the slave was capable of love, didn't believe that enslaved people were capable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. And so you have to hold both of those things as true when you think of Jefferson, right? You have to hold the idea that he is foundational to the project of the American experiment, and that he also perpetuated human bondage, knowing that it was wrong, but doing it anyway. And I think that people have a hard time sitting with stories about America that run counter to the stories they have grown up with. Because I think so many people's identities and sense of self are tied to a specific story of America. And when you begin to tell a new story of this country, a more expansive story, a more honest story, right? When you begin not to only talk about Jefferson as the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but also the person who wrote Notes on the State of Virginia. People attempt to say like, oh, you're trying to indoctrinate students, or you're trying to like push a set of political dispositions, and really you're just trying to tell a fuller story than has been told. But for many people, that represents an existential crisis, because I think about my time at the Confederate Cemetery, and a guy named Jeff, who was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans when I was there, he was telling me about how his granddaddy used to take him to that cemetery, and they would sit in the gazebo and they would watch the dragonflies at night and the deer scamper through, and his grandfather would sing him songs of Old Dixie and tell him stories of the 30,000 men buried in this cemetery who fought a war not for slavery but for their communities, to protect their families. And now Jeff passes those stories along to his children. And so when Jeff is forced to confront primary source documents or empirical evidence that the Confederacy indeed seceded from the Union because of slavery and fought the Civil War because of slavery, in which there are a plethora of those documents. If you look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, a state like Mississippi says very explicitly, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Right? So they're not vague about why they're seceding, like all the other states are quite clear. But for Jeff, it is not simply a matter of like having to reassess a new history. It is a threat to who he understands his grandfather to be. It is a threat to how he understands the very foundation of their relationship. And as a result, it is a threat to who he understands himself to be. And so I think it is profoundly difficult, because so many people's sense of who they are is tied to a series of lies about this country. And that, as a human, that is a hard thing to navigate. But that's not to say that you shouldn't do it. I think we all have stories we've been told as young people by our families that then we grow up and have to say, well, actually, the story that we were told is maybe a little different than the one that's true. But and so we have to confront that.
It's complex, and sometimes we like the simple. I want to ask you maybe some advice that you might have for those who are listening to us now, for our local leaders who are really reckoning with some of our local history as well. And I know that you were a student at Davidson. Don't know if you're familiar with Latta Plantation, but it was recently closed after advertising a Juneteenth celebration, and some of the social media posts promised to tell the story of defeated Confederate soldiers and a slave owner who was chased out of his home by the Yankees. And then we also have Charlotte's Legacy Commission that has identified 9 streets in the city that they are going to rename because they honored slaveholders or those who supported the Confederacy. And our local school district has renamed 2 schools, one that was named for a slaveholder, another that was named for a white supremacist. So we have local leaders who are really looking around our community with a different lens, and wonder if you have any advice for them as they begin that journey.
Yeah, well, I'm heartened to hear that those changes are underway. And I think 2 things. I think I would say it's important to think of the school name changes, or the taking down of monuments, the changing in the names of spaces, as an entry point to a larger set of issues, right? Like, it doesn't begin and end with the renaming of a school. Like, after you rename a school, the school will not like be shed of its of the residue of racism that shaped what the sort of outcomes that school is experiencing. It's a question also of resources. It's a question also of what sort of lessons are our students being taught in these schools. And I think we're in this really fraught political moment where we have this sort of critical race theory boogeyman that is being willfully distorted and wielded as a weapon to push back against a very profound shift in public consciousness that has happened over the past several years, in which more people have begun to understand the history of racism, not as just an interpersonal phenomenon, but as a structural one, as a systemic one, as a historical one, as one that is deeply embedded in the story of this country. And I think that all it is trying to do is give us a fuller story with which to understand the country we live in. And so I think that I would encourage our community leaders to not succumb to the boogeyman that is being wielded and sort of pushed around to suggest that students are being indoctrinated. Because there is a difference between a teacher trying to indoctrinate a students with their own beliefs, and then versus trying to expand a student's set of what they understand as truth, right? When you bring it back to Jefferson, when you talk about Jefferson, when you talk about what Jefferson wrote on his Notes on the State of Virginia about Black people, that's not indoctrinating students with a set of political beliefs. That's actually an intellectually and academically more rigorous task for them to do, is to sit with the sort of contradictions of one of the people who was central to the founding of this country. And so on one end, I would encourage people to push back against so much of the rhetoric that is emanating from that space. And then secondly, with regard to monuments and sort of iconography, one of the things that I'm interested in is, like, are we building monuments to individuals, or are we building monuments to communities? Are we building monuments to like groups of people? Because we know, as tempting as it is to like make everything, to orient large moments of social change to single people or single heroic individuals, what we know is that social change happens in every facet across generations from large groups of ordinary people doing remarkable things. And so, I admire MLK as much as the next guy. I admire Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and I talk about this in the book. Like, what would it look like to have monuments to just like ordinary community members, right? People who were like central to that block, people who were central to that neighborhood, and making it not even just one statue, but like a group. Some of my favorite statues are like groups of people, are statues of families. In Washington, D.C., there's a statue at the African American Civil War Museum. And it's an African American family. And on the other side, it's a group of African American soldiers. And on the other side, and so it's reflective of the communal nature of change. And the last point on this, we often memorialize and create monuments to our past, but what would it look like to create memorials and monuments to our future and to our aspirations? Like, what would having markers that are orienting us toward where we're trying to go look like? What would it, and I'm not an artist, so there are all sorts of ways that artists could create this, but like memorials to justice, memorials to equality, memorials to empathy, right? Like, what if we had those as part of our landscape, as these sort of daily reminders? How might that orient the direction that we're going as communities, as much as we use the past to orient us as well?
I love you for casting that vision right there and just really reminding us all that we live in community. As you mentioned at the beginning, I wish we had more time, but I'm going to close us out with some of your words. And you really close out the book also by quoting a historian that says, the problem with the memory of slavery is that we have too many gaps in our memory. And then you go on and say, in order for our country to collectively move forward, it is not enough to have a patchwork of places that are honest about this history while being surrounded by other spaces that undermine it. It must be a collective endeavor to learn and confront the story of slavery and how it has shaped the world we live in today. And then you go on to say, at some point, it is no longer a question of whether we can learn this history, but whether we have the collective will to reckon with it. I want to thank you for working to fill in some of our gaps with your work and how the word is passed. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Charlotte's been such a segregated city in so many realms. One of the ways, I think, is number one, mass transit, having a real system that truly takes people from any place in the city to any other place.
When people really put their money where their mouth is and they support the social programs that we need to break the cycle of poverty in this country and really look at what those systems are that are causing striations between racial groups, and then something gets done.
I think the only way we are going to get out of this is to adequately publicly fund education. We need actual teachers in our classrooms that are well paid and can support their families.
It goes back to what are the things that we share in common in a community? Is it having a safe neighborhood? Is it having good schools for our children? Is it being able to come out on one accord with one thing rather than being so polarized? And if people can find the fact that their voice may have value, then perhaps collectively we can move forward.
I think awareness, right? So if we don't admit that it's happening, I think that it's going to continue to happen. So if we don't do what we're doing here, talking about it, then no one's going to be aware of it.
I do think there's a reckoning. I think that it's just time for people to take a closer look and take action, when it comes to racial injustice.
We have to spend time talking to people and educating people. People are fearful of people who don't look like them, live where they live, think like them, act like them. It's fear, and education can dispel fear.
Well, Claude, here we are again. Remembering 1997 when CBI began.
Yeah. In December of that year, a diverse group of over 600 people came together at the Convention Center for 2 powerful days to work on how we were going to live together. We named the conference Something Has Begun, and something certainly did and has.
Yes, it did. Why do you think CBI has continued to grow? And why are you still committed and involved?
Wow. In the course of the past 24 years, CBI has assisted individuals and institutions to pursue individual, institutional, and communal change by meeting urgency with agency. 2 fundamental components, urgency and agency. Many, having read Harvard Business School professor and change guru John Cotter's work on leading change, recall that the first step to leading change of any kind is creating agency. The creation of urgency entails the bringing of awareness that promotes ownership of the situation and seeing a preferred future possibility. In CBI lingo, it is waking up. Agency, however, is the committing to making that possibility a reality. It operates at the personal, the practical, the positional, the political, and here's a big word, pecuniary, that means money, levels. That would be interrupting and stepping up. Through its varied programs, people and the places they lead, CBI has impacted by the creation of leaders who possess a deeper awareness, a heightened sensitivity, a stronger commitment, and a greater courage to be agents of awakening, creative interruption, and stepping up to make a difference. Certainly that has been the case for me. It's hard to believe, 24 years.
Yes, I know. Quarter of a century.
Yeah. The time that we inhabit is an urgent one at many levels. And the aftershocks are calling for the exercising of every aspect of the agency. So as we emerge with a greater awareness and ownership, having interrogated the stories that we've been told and the dissonance created by what is and what is and what is and what is, we're called to a prophetic imagination, imagining a preferable future. Intentionality, courage, and perseverance. My friends, an investment in CBI is an investment in the individuals and institutions that help transform our community.
When I think about how CBI has grown and the growing number of people who have invested themselves financially in this work over the past 2 decades, I clearly remember in 2002 when one CBI leadership team member, that's what we called our board, asked if individuals could contribute to the work of CBI. Imagine that, individuals. Today, each year, we have over 300 people making gifts of $20 to $2,500 to CBI. We rely on this support, and we hope that you will join or rejoin with your gift today. It's so easy to give. You can see a Donate Now button right on your screen. Here is a link to our website where you'll find a secure giving platform. Please do it today because every gift counts. Usually we have 75 to 100 new givers at every breakfast. Can we do at least that or more this year? Of course, if it's time for you to renew your support of CBI, we hope you'll do it today and be as generous as possible.
This is your chance to exercise that pecuniary agency, economic. You know, I cannot end without the 24 years of CBI have always had you. Your stewardship, your care, your curiosity, your conscientiousness. That is in multiple generations of LDI people and leaders under 40, and all of us. So I just want to thank you for giving so much of yourself to our community.
No, my darling. It is a blessing. It is a blessing. It is a blessing. But we'll keep going, right? And now one more chance to hear people in our community share some thoughts about reconnecting with you. Love you.
Ya ahora estamos permitiendo poder viajar un poco más y reconectarnos con los seres queridos, pero con mucho cuidado.
People just need to be open-minded, educated. You know, I'm just hopeful that people just open their minds. You know, don't be so close-minded.
I think Charlotte or any town or country or whatever just needs to be honest about the division that's going on and then deal with that from an honest perspective.
I think a lot of it's been rethinking about what's important, where do I want to spend my time, and what do I want to be doing.
We will never tackle and conquer this monster of racism until we really are able to talk about it openly, discuss it, and then come up together with solutions.
I try to do it with my artwork and my photography. God gave me a little creative talent, and I'm trying to use that to talk to people.
We're being a lot more choosy about where we go and how we function when we get there. We still aren't going to crowded places. We're doing a lot of these kinds of things outdoors. It's just a constant decision about risk.
Everything I think should be done through open communication, sitting down and listening to both sides of the story.
We don't all have to focus in our little groups. We can branch outside of that and really learn from each other. If we have those conversations, we're willing to have those conversations and be open-minded and open-hearted.
Bishop and Diane are a hard act to follow, but you know, good morning, everyone. My name is Kendall Phillips.
And I am Eugene Young.
As employees of Wells Fargo Bank, we are honored to stand before you this morning as the presenting sponsor of this year's Stakeholders Breakfast. Proudly, Wells Fargo has been the presenting sponsor of this event and this important work since 1997.
Kendall and I also serve on the board of directors for CBI, are members of this year's Stakeholders Breakfast Planning Committee, and are previous participants in CBI programs, including the Leadership Development Initiative, Leaders Under 40, and Equity Impact Circles. Wells Fargo Investment in Us is one example of the company's commitment to equity and inclusion by locally helping to drive CBI's mission, which is to provide the knowledge, skills, and courage to fight bias, remove barriers to opportunity, and build a more equitable and just community. Like you, I've heard so many things this morning that have resonated with me, and I hope you have picked up a few nuggets as well. Now is the opportunity to check in and discuss with other breakfast participants what you have seen and heard.
In just a moment, each of you will automatically be placed in a virtual table conversation groups. If you find yourself in a group without a moderator, we hope you will step up to do that. You should have received a link earlier this week with the downloadable materials, which includes a placement that provides the guided conversation questions for this portion. To ensure we are all aligned, the questions are: first, what aftershocks have you felt most strongly this year in the wake of everything we've gone through since 2020? Second, what struck you about the conversation with Clint Smith? And lastly, what makes you hopeful? The moderators will ensure the conversation moves along and that everyone who wants to share has the opportunity.
We only have 15 minutes this morning, and I know that will not be enough. There will be a clock counting down the time at the top right-hand corner to help keep us all on track. A pop-up will warn you when we only have 1 minute left. Then we will be all brought back together. If you should need technical assistance, please try the Help Desk tab on the main menu of your screen. Okay, we're all set now. Enjoy the virtual table conversations, and we look forward to welcoming you back to share some exciting opportunities happening in the coming months, along with the presentation you will not want to miss.
Welcome back from our discussions. I hope that your Zoom rooms were as lively as our conversations. I'm Eli Portillo, a CBI board member. Along with my fellow board member, Jeep Bryant, I had the pleasure of serving as one of the co-chairs for this breakfast, helping to plan and bring it to life.
You know, Eli, we've heard a lot this morning that is challenging and inspiring us both at the same time. And we heard from several of you in the Zoom rooms that there's a concern that the aftershocks that we've all experienced have made the divisions in the community feel greater. There was also an appreciation for how Dr. Smith gave us some language to use, this notion of cognitive dissonance, and how that can be helpful in really understanding why the discussions of systemic racism and bias are so hard. But Eli, I also heard from one of the rooms saying that when Dr. Smith talked about we need a language, we need a toolkit to honestly assess where we are, folks said that is what CBI provides to us. It's just really important that we take the toolkit and use it.
That's great to hear. So far this morning, we've been talking a lot, but sometimes images can convey the meaning we seek even more effectively. Art can be even more memorable and powerful.
It can, and that's why CBI is commissioning a new piece of art that will build on the conversations that we've started this morning. It's a mural that will soon be visible to everyone in our community. Charlotte Center City Partners has provided the canvas. It's a large shipping container at Victoria Yards uptown. And the CBI team now is working with a diverse group of artists who will capture the meaning and spirit of the Aftershocks theme.
Let's enjoy a brief overview of this new project, which we are excited to bring to the community in the coming weeks.
My work primarily focuses around the human experience of marginalized communities, giving a voice to those who maybe don't have the loudest voice at the table, and so just like speaking to that experience.
My style consists more of like photorealism, but a little bit of like a whimsical element, something somewhat surreal but tied to reality, and then I like to kind of bring that to life, just as if you're walking about your day and something a little more than natural.
Well, what resonated with me about Aftershocks is the fact that we have all been affected by this pandemic. We've been in the house, we've been isolated from other people, and I'm interested in speaking to how do we rebuild after that? How do we come together as a community to actually get past those things? So I think that giving that a visual narrative is what I'm most interested in on this project.
I actually started my full-time freelance career within the first few months of the COVID initial shock. And so from that aftershock, seeing the creative kind of uprising has been very powerful.
Collaborating with other artists is a way for us to show how we are coming out of this pandemic together, stronger together. We all have a voice, and everybody's voice is important. And when we bring them together, we speak louder than with one individual. So I'm interested in seeing other artists and how they approach this idea of the aftershock or the rebuilding, the rebirth, and collaborating with them to come up with something awesome.
Definitely looking forward to collaborating with these artists. I'm looking forward to sitting down and kind of hashing out ideas with them, kind of see what some of these other artists are looking forward to showcasing and how we can really emphasize that and make the best possible outcome.
Well, this would be a brand new experience for me. I've never worked on a shipping container, but it'll be fun.
Many thanks to the artists who are now working with us, and we hope you'll stay tuned for updates about when the work will be complete. We'll be keeping you posted on how you can see and engage with the mural.
CBI's mission is to equip people in our community to wake up, interrupt, and step up. And as we recommit, reconnect, and rebuild following the earthquakes and aftershocks that we've all been through, and that we're still going through, CBI will be there to help with a full slate of programming and ways for you to connect.
For example, CBI's bus tours through the community really help us understand how we got to where we are now. Equity impact circles can help small groups come together to discuss how can we remove the barriers to equity and equality in our community.
And a recording of our talk with Clint will also be available to rewatch and share. We hope that you'll take advantage of this to help us spread the word. And now we'd like to welcome CBI Board Chair Rick McDermott back up.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. Thank you, Jeep and Eli. Wow, what a program this has been. I hope all of you are as energized as I am about CBI and its work in our community. Once again, thank you so much to our sponsors and donors for making today possible. Special thanks to our Stakeholders Breakfast planning team and the leadership of Jeep and Eli. And of course, to the CBI team of staff, faculty, and specialists who bring CBI's work to life each and every day. Speaking of the CBI team, as I mentioned in my comments earlier, Diane English, our founding executive director, announced earlier this year that she will retire at the end of this year. Diane has led CBI from its beginnings, as you heard, as a short-term task force formed in the late 90s to address the mounting racial turmoil erupting in our city at that time, to CBI's current status as a mature and dynamic organization working tirelessly to educate people and organizations and to form leaders in our community around issues of inclusion and equity. Diane, I know you're out there somewhere. Come on up here. I know that there are going to be other celebrations and opportunities for us to thank you for everything that you've done, but I and we didn't want this stakeholders breakfast to end without expressing our gratitude. Through CBI, we all aspire to be able to use ourselves to influence for change in our community. And you have been a shining example of that. When you, through the last 24 years, have woken up, interrupted, and stepped up.
Tried.
No, you have done an amazing job.
I mainly awakened, and the people who have loved me through my ignorance.
Well, you have done it all for us. You've been a shining example, and I know for me personally, I've learned so much from you. It was like destiny that I got involved with CBI in the beginning, and I'm so happy that I was able to serve on the board and serve as your chair.
Thank you. It was destiny for me too.
Yes.
I know that.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. So what a great morning. Thank you all for joining us here this morning, and have a great day.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes.
I've got that sticker in my car. I've got that CBI sticker on my dashboard. You can't get away from it. It's Hotel California.
It is. It is.
Oh, what fun. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What are we? We're out, right?